If you'd like to earn CPE credit for listening to this episode, visit earmarkcpe.com. Download the app, take a short quiz, and get your CPE certificate. Continuing education has never been so easy. And now, on to the episode.
Hello, and welcome to Oh My Fraud, a true crime podcast where our criminals use laser pointers, not laser gun sights. I'm Greg Kyte.
And I'm Caleb Newquist.
Caleb, before we get into the podcast proper, I just want to take this opportunity, as we have, to read a listener review real quick.
Okay.
The user's name is user_apps. And they said, my God, if you want someone who laughs at their own jokes and goes off topic more than someone with ADD and laughs as is sounds like 10 people laughing, awful.
They forgot about the free CPE though.
Right, yeah, right. I think that's but I think that they had a very comprehensive review, except that was the one oversight.
Yeah. I mean, you are entitled to your opinion, user_APS.
Yeah, it's a valid opinion.
Sure.
If you're entitled to your opinion, you're entitled to not reread your comment before you post it. It's all good.
Right.
It's all fair game.
If you like Oh My Fraud, at least as much as user_APS, take a minute to write us a review. But make sure that you mention that our laughing makes your ears bleed and that you get free CPE if you listen on the Earmark app.
Perfect. So, Caleb,
yes,
to change subjects, to get us into our podcast for today, I wanted to ask you about other podcasts.
Yes.
And specifically, have you met any other podcast hosts? And I'm not talking I'm talking like ones that are in the strata that's far above us, like super popular ones. Are there any that you've met, or any that you'd like really like to meet in real life?
I mean, it's pretty boring if I say no, right?
Well, but again, I'm okay with user apps review. I'm also okay with you saying if that just doesn't interest you.
No, I will
think
play
it would
this
be
game.
interesting if that did not interest you.
I will play this game. I've been listening to the podcast a long time. I mean, if I met Ira Glass, that would probably be pretty nerdy and exciting. And so,
yeah,
but I don't even know what I would say to Ira Glass.
Right.
But, I just am a fan. I'd just be like, hey, I'm a fan, love what you do, whatever. Like one of my favorite podcasts is, and Greg was actually the person who turned me on to it, is WTF with Mark Maron. I've seen Maron do comedy many, many times. He does a great I love his podcast. I know people have their beefs with his style, but I think he's great. I don't know about meeting him though, because
so you've never met him, even though you've been to tons of his shows.
I haven't. No, I haven't met him.
He doesn't do like a meet and greet after the show.
No, he does. He
or
doesn't. No.
Okay.
I haven't met him, and I mean,
yeah. Well, here's because
do you have a Maron story? I don't know.
I do, because
okay.
I did.
You
I
did
got to meet him once.
Oh, you did.
Yeah.
Oh, what's the story?
Yeah.
That's interesting.
So he did his show. He was just touring, did his show at Wise Guys.
Mm-hmm.
It was actually the same Wise Guys that you were at before, where we did that fraud live fraud CPE at a comedy club 100 years ago.
Yeah.
So it was that venue. Maron did his show. I was not on a show. I didn't open for him, but but one of the things that happens a lot of times is that if you get somebody like that who is just widely admired in the comedy community, then everybody, all the local comedians show up and just kind of slink around the back of the room and watch the show, and afterwards you're kind of going, hey, I guess I'll hang out and see if I can meet him. And so I was one of those that was doing that. But listen, it was I bounced so quick, after his show, he ends up being in the lobby of the club, and I swear there's like 10 or 12 of us just no-name local comedians who are also, it felt like we were sitting in this weird circle in the lobby of the comedy club, and nobody was really talking that much. There was not lively conversation. It was just sitting around, and I was part of the problem too. I wasn't saying anything either, because the problem I had is is if you meet someone in real life whose podcast because his podcast is twice a week, right?
It is. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I had at that point I had listened to his bi-weekly podcast for years.
Yeah, right.
And because of that, I realized it was impossible for me to think of a question to ask this guy that I didn't already know the fucking answer to. So how do you chit chat with someone when you already know, when you've never met him, but you already know everything about him?
Yeah.
So
that's a good point.
That was my nice guy. Don't have any complaints about him, but it was weird to meet someone that you just knew so much about.
Yeah.
And so the whole reason we're talking about any of this at all is because on this episode, we get to meet and we get to interview one of the forefathers of fraud podcasting.
Yeah.
Which really just means the guy who did a fraud podcast before us.
Just
That's
a few
all.
years ago. Yeah.
Exactly. So his name's Chris Marquet. He had a show that was on the Voice America Radio Network. It's like an online radio thing. He did his podcast back in 2014, 2015. You can actually still access all of his podcast episodes, which I consumed all of them, loved all of them. You can still get them through Amazon. We'll try to put a link in the show notes to where you can find those. He also published an annual report on embezzlement. And as we talked to him, we found out he also did an annual report on Ponzi schemes and a bunch of other white papers on lots of different topics related to fraud and white collar crimes and things like that. He's worked as a fraud investigator for 40 years, and he was just a wonderful guest. So a guy that I listened to on a podcast a bunch that exceeded my expectation as a guest on our show. So without wasting any more time, here is our lovely interview with Chris Marquet. Chris Marquet, so excited. As you know, I'm very excited to have you on our podcast. Thanks for being with us today. We're excited. I got a million questions I want to ask you.
Absolutely, Caleb and Greg. It's an honor to be with you guys.
So first off, just so that the listeners know, you are based just outside of Boston, correct?
That's right.
Okay, perfect. And then would you, so real quick, I know, will you give us just a real quick kind of like not your CV, but just the high points? Like what are the different initials you have after your name? Because you're a detective. That's like your main gig, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, right out of undergraduate school, I joined Kroll Associates, which anybody in the fraud industry should know is the big dog in the investigative world. And so this is back in 1983, right out of undergraduate school. I joined as an analyst associate, and I stayed there for 20 years. But when I joined it was like 25 employees, small shop. Jules Kroll, who still a legend in the investigative fraud risk mitigation world, ran the shop and was my mentor essentially. And I was like, I got to go back to law school, or I got to go to B school or something. And
he was telling you that, or you were just
he's
thinking
telling
that?
me. I'm saying I got to go back to school again. If I want to go forward, he said, no, Chris,
gotcha.
you're getting your MBA right here. You got your law. I'm like, all right, whatever. So I stayed there for 20 years, and he threw me into all these different roles. I was an analyst, and a writer of reports and pulled stuff together and got involved in every kind of case you can imagine. And at Kroll, it was a lot of international work too. Caleb, you had a question.
I do. Yeah, I was curious. So was your undergrad studies, was that criminal justice, or how did you prepare, and how did you just go straight into Kroll?
So I went to Dartmouth College up in New Hampshire, and I had three majors. I had physics. My family was a science math family, so I was a physics major first. I finished that major by the end of my junior year. But I didn't really want to be a scientist, so like my father and my brother was a nuclear sub officer. Went to the Naval Academy, but so I studied economics. I was thinking, business, that's kind of where I want. So I added economics as a double major, and then I added philosophy as a third major because I wanted to go on an overseas program in Scotland. which I did. So I did 3 majors.
Nice.
So one was a science, one was social science, one was a humanities. And the philosophy piece actually was really interesting and helped me write, because writing, what I felt, was my weakest strength, because I was a science math guy, right? I was an analytical guy. Anyway, so I do that, and it's 1983. There's still a recession going. Trying to get a job at any of the big consulting firms in Boston and New York. Just not having a lot of success. And went to New York hardcore looking for a job. I got two different job offers. One was at this little tiny Kroll Associates consulting firm that sounded really interesting, and the other one was to be a bond trader at Brown Brothers Harriman down on Wall Street. Like, okay, it's so boring. My wife likes to say, "Look, we would have had that house out in the Hamptons, if we'd done
right.
Yeah,
but you would have been long gone. My third wife, whatever,
Right. You would have had to forfeit your soul for that.
Exactly. Anyway, so the Kroll job was fascinating, and it just transformed. My dad's like, I sent you to Dartmouth. I went to Ivy League school to be a private investigator. Anyway, so I don't really think of myself as a private investigator. I'm an information gatherer and that helps decision making in critical situations. So yes, I gather information all over the world. We do all kinds of very interesting things, working a lot with lawyers, sadly, but necessarily. Love, hate, right? They're my clients. They some can be very, very difficult, but we get brought into difficult circumstances, frauds cases, you name it. So it became a really interesting job, and Jules Kroll kept me doing different things. He had me running a unit. I did a political risk unit, a travel safety security unit. Again, I'm learning this stuff as I'm going. Then I ran, the whole sort of, we merged with a couple times, and I was involved in a lot of that stuff. I went to Russia on the case, a big, massive case that we worked on behalf of the Russian government after Yeltsin took over. Gorbachev
Really
stepped down. And the job, the project was finding hard currency assets outside of Russia that they wanted to try to repatriate to the to Russia, because that was the currency of the ruble is still worth, it's nothing, right? It's useless. So the hard currencies that these Russian oligarchs, even in the Soviet era, had begun amassing were over, offshore, and they wanted to bring it back. So that was a fascinating project that I was involved in, and went to Russia to do that.
And did you find a bunch of stuff for them? Were they able?
Oh, yeah, there was stuff. So I mean, it was just bizarro world where we would go. So we pulled together a team. We had ex-KGB. I'm sorry, we had our ex-CIA. We had our ex-MI6, MI5. We had our ex-Mossad and Shin Bet, and French, German intelligence folks. Very interesting group of people pulled together on our side, and they had their sort of team that worked for we were actually working for the Treasury Department for the Russian Federation.
So it sounds like that movie The Expendables, but just with nerds. Is that
well, I mean, yeah. So we would have these meetings in Moscow, and they would be on one side of the table, we'd be on the other, and it was just a collective group of these ex spooks on our side in their case. And then we would report, we found this in Cyprus, and this prop real estate thing owned by this shell company, and blah, blah, over here in southern France, and the KGB. We know about that one. I mean, it's like, okay, great.
Yeah,
these guys knew about all of them. But
right. Well, that was just to save face, though, right? They just didn't want to.
Yeah, I mean,
or do you think they really knew about them already?
Well, the intelligence guys knew about a lot of it.
Okay.
So I think it was a matter. Yes, it is a matter of saving face, and it was a matter of sort of going through a drill, because they would put it out, to the people. They were trying. Look, the Soviet era is over. We're moving toward, democracy and the new Russian Federation. Boris Yeltsin wanted to turn the page and show that they were actually doing something to help the country move forward. So,
Yeah.
so it was, in some respects, it was a PR kind of a thing, but it was also, I think, a legitimate exercise. But it was a fascinating thing that, again, I've traveled all over the globe during those years, and really learned by doing. So that's how I kind of got into this whole space, and I never left. So it's now hard to believe, 40 years.
Yeah.
I started in 1983, the summer of 1983, after I graduated from college, and wow, I'm still doing this. But it's fun. I mean, that's the thing. It's fun work.
So to follow to follow the thread, so you started at Kroll, and then you started your own firm that was Marquet International. Was that what the name of your firm?
Yeah, actually, there was an interregnum. There was a group of us left Kroll. We started a company called Citygate Global Intelligence. It was owned by a British company. We rolled out. We got acquired immediately by a British company. They had a whole bunch of different companies. And that firm lasted about, I want to say, 4 years or so. It was a bunch of ex-Crowleys and others that we pulled together. So it was a mini Kroll. And, it's kind of, I told Jules, I said, look, I gotta go do this. Just, if I don't do this now, I'm never going to do it, and he understood. So we're still, friends today, but
yeah.
He didn't look happily to some of the other folks who did this. Never burn your bridges, people, right?
Absolutely.
Always keep that line going. And anyway, so it was a mini Kroll, and I was one of the founders of that. That lasted about 4 years. The parent company blew up. And it put us in a very difficult position. We couldn't hold it together. We tried to do an MBO, that didn't work. So then I worked for a year for Vance International Decision Strategies. About a year or so for them before I started Marquet International in 2000, at the beginning of 2006, I think it was. Yeah. So Marquet International was basically me at the helm, and my little team, and lots of people out in the field that I could pull in as I needed them. So that entity still exists.
Okay.
Although I use it really only as sort of my personal vehicle. My personal corporate vehicle. My current business is called Veritas Assurance Partners. Veritas, as in truth, assurance, ASSURANCE, partners. And so I'm one of 3 partners in this newer enterprise. One of whom, and this is relevant, one of whom is a forensic accountant by training, who I knew back in the Kroll days, terrific guy named Billy Marlin. The other is a retired full bird Colonel JAG Corps U.S. Army fellow named Manny Supervale, who's down in Miami. So it's a really interesting group between the 3 of us. And again, we're doing a lot of international work. We get brought into difficult projects, depending on the project, we've got the forensic accounting piece. We have the capabilities in the computer forensics and what have you, and the traditional investigative stuff, et cetera, et cetera. So we're a small boutique shop, nimble, and can move quickly. So we compete against the big boys and girls, I guess I should.
So here's my next question is, like, even from some of the stuff you've already said, you're like I'm going to Moscow to do this international thing with these Russian oligarchs. I assume you've also been to like Johannesburg and probably Banff, Canada, just the sexiest places on earth. And but because I've had like, every now and then the idea of becoming a fraud examiner, because doing work similar crossed my mind, because it seems super sexy. But then I've always wondered, is like the day-to-day stuff just the most like, does the sex appeal of being Chris Marquet, does that fall off when you actually are like just going through an endless pile of receipts trying to tie these out? What's the I want to know, how sexy is your job? How sexy is your life?
It's not so sexy. So, I mean, in the old days, yes. So I've been to Australia on work. I've been to Asia. I've been to Alaska. Banff, no. I was there as a
No,
kid.
no.
Not in Banff, but and Joburg. We had a big case out of South Africa but I wasn't part of that project back in the Kroll days. So in the old days, you would go to these places, and because the internet was nascent and the amount of information was not as available. So you would go, you'd have local folks that would support you, local investigators, ex-RCMP up in Canada, whatever. And you would pull it together there. I mean, I'd go to Miami and do a bunch of interviews or whatever. Yeah, you have to do that kind of thing face to face. Less so these days, where even in the forensic accounting, all the documents get dumped and sent, so you got a back office of accountants that are cranking through stuff sitting somewhere else. They don't have to be on site. You really do have to have people in a complex fraud case. It's better to have people on site that can at least direct things, do some select interviews, make sure they're gathering the right documents and getting those to the people who are doing the analysis of those documents and that sort of thing. So it's less travel today than it once was. And in the nitty gritty of any given case is not so sexy, because you're going through information, whatever, it's public records, it's real estate transactions, it's, it could be whatever, expense reports, it's simple stuff that you're looking at and pulling together for the client. So the travel, not as much as it once was. I mean, I literally, one trip went around the globe, started in New York, San Francisco, LA, Tokyo, Hong Kong, Singapore, Sydney,
right.
back up.
Which again sounds so sexy, but then after you get your first blood clot from sitting for that long, and then it's just,
you got to move around. You got
a daily blood thinner, just not sexy at all.
You got to move around.
Okay,
go ahead.
Okay, so going back into Caleb's question about like how do you get your business? I know you know this. I know of you. I have admired you from afar for years because of your podcast called Fraud Talk. Which, by the way, have you sued the ACFE for taking your title of your podcast?
No.
Okay, but then you also reported. It was an annual report, the Marquet report on embezzlement. That was an annual report, right?
Yeah, so I wrote this white paper essentially for I think 6 or 7 or 8 years in a row on embezzlement. I just called it the Marquet Report on Embezzlement, and that was sort of a labor of love. It was because I got involved in a lot of one of the specialties I think I have is employee misconduct, executive misconduct investigations. Okay, and that runs actually a fairly wide gamut, from harassment and abuse and assaults and physical whatever, to stealing intellectual property, to stealing actual money. So looking at the money cases, the embezzlement cases, I thought, hey, this is something we really haven't examined too closely, and nobody's ever really done that. So I decided I'm going to sort of really try to dig deep into it and try to figure out some things. Who are the perpetrators? Who are the victims? What are the normal victims in these kinds of cases? What are the characteristics of how they do it? Or what are the methods that they use? How does it get found out? Those kinds of analytical questions that have really never been delved into very deep. So I would just take 1 year and say, okay, and I would identify the cases that became public during that year of major embezzlements, anything over 100,000. I didn't look at anything less because it would be too much. You'd die before you got them all.
Which is crazy too, because based on the ACFE's report, their biannual report to the nation, I don't have this locked in, but I'm pretty sure the median loss due to asset misappropriation, which is our embezzlement cases, is typically the median loss is typically under $100,000 for that. So if you're looking, the cases you were looking at were not even half of the cases for the entire year.
Oh yeah. So think of an iceberg, right? You got a little tiny bit showing. The most of it's underwater. I mean, so you're not really seeing.
Right.
Fraud happens every day, right? You're never going to stop it all. It's just a matter of how much you can tamp it down within a given organization. So underneath the water, you've got everyday fraud. People are taking the pencils and the petty cash every day, all day, right? That happens all the time. So then you work your way up to more sophisticated stealing of things, monies. And so I said, all right, well, let's look at these cases where really large sums have been absconded from an organization and dig into that, because obviously they went for a period of time, and there's no way to really identify a lot of these little cases. The other factor is that law enforcement typically, the feds, if it's not 100, well, it used to be 100 grand, it's probably like 250 now. If it's not that much, they don't care. So
right.
And then the state bar level, for them, okay, that's lower than the Fed level, but it's still a level of, if it's less than 10 grand or 20 or 25, they don't care, because the amount of resources they got to pull and devote to get into it. So I said, all right, let's take the big cases and let's dig into them, which I did. And some very interesting things came out of that, which were, number one, that women were more often than not the ones doing the stealing. But they also showed that more often than not, somebody in the fiduciary role, a bookkeeper, et cetera, was doing the taking. So some of that might be explained that, a lot of women in the bookkeeping department, right? So maybe that's part of that, what accounts for that. But then on the other side, men tended to steal a lot more than the women did. So if you're smart, you'd start taking just little increments, little bits, every month or whatever. And over time it adds up, and you don't get caught over a long period of time.
Right.
But sometimes it collapses under its own weight, like as in a Ponzi scheme situation. But so women often more frequently the perpetrators. Men, though, stole more than the women on average. The most common victim was a financial type of an institution. Which
really?
Again, makes sense. Where why did you steal? Why did you rob the bank? Well, that's where the money is, right?
Right. Yeah. Okay.
That's right.
Famous line.
Yeah.
And then government entities were the second most frequent victim.
Right.
Then you get into, other categories, nonprofits and religious organizations, oftentimes for victims, because the controls were non-existent or very, very weak.
Yeah.
And so it was a cool way of sort of breaking it down, looking at it. I also looked at it geographically, where there are some states that were more likely than others. Vermont, from some crazy ass reason, became
lots of stealing in Vermont.
Lots of stealing in Vermont. Well, Vermont has the highest per capita nonprofits, and they're the third category, right?
Yeah.
Lots of little mom and pop family run businesses.
Okay.
Category, and lots of little municipalities, which are thinly controlled. So I think for that reason, and you got this sort of trusting environment. So maybe that's why Vermont was always at the top of the list.
So you mentioned trusting environments, and Greg and I have talked about this on a lot of episodes, especially as it relates to, as you point out, like we did a whole episode on religion and fraud, for example, but we've also talked about small businesses. And, the overall kind of takeaway, or the big takeaway that we talk about every time, is like, people just want to trust each other in these kind of small organizations, and that's what leaves them so vulnerable. Like, over the course of your career, has that changed at all? It just feels like this is something that our human characteristics just won't let us be kind of objective and sober about it. Like, if we're doing business with family, or if we're doing business with friends, or if we're in a small community, in a tight-knit community, we don't want to trouble people with internal controls and really elaborate kind of bureaucracy when it's not needed. And that is what leaves people vulnerable and exposed. I mean, has that, over the course of your career, have you seen that change at all?
Not really.
Yeah.
No, I mean, you're exactly correct. It is. I think it is. And there's also a certain amount of, it's both societal sort of, wanting to get along and go along and not ruffle feathers or create a waves, but also sort of, a little bit of laziness. I don't want to.
Yeah.
I'm dealing with my brother-in-law, whatever. He would never steal. Or
right.
It's in a church. I mean, look, Madoff abused basically, it was a Jewish community that he was in, and he created this sort of aura that, I'm investing with Bernie Madoff, and oh well, he only takes certain clients, and it made it was both getting the Louis Vuitton bag, but at the same time he really focused in a community. A lot of Ponzi schemers, and Utah. You're in Utah, right?
We got
the Mormon Church and other groups where they focused in a religious order, and there's an immediate trust factor that goes along with that, and as a result, so your guard is down. They're never going to abuse the trust, but they do. So unfortunately, you have this element in human nature also. So on one hand, you've got I want to trust. I want to believe people that I've come to know, and and things are going to be okay. On the other hand, you have people who are willing to step over the line under the right circumstances. Sometimes it's like, okay, I got caught up in gambling and now I got to steal from my employer to keep that habit going. They're not thinking that rationally, obviously. Or it's a drug addiction, or it's I got a divorce situation and now I gotta pay for the kid's college because my ex is a jerk and he's not paying, blah, blah, So they justify these things to do the bad thing that they wouldn't necessarily do. And then what I found, at least in the embezzlement situation, was that over time, and that first of all, they see how easy it is. You're sitting in the accounting department, you're whatever, and you're writing checks to an entity you created, and it's $972 a month, It adds up over, and then they start doing something else. But they come to believe there's a whole psychology here that I think also is yet to really been delved into, the psychology of fraudsters and what's really going on there. But I think they come to believe either for they're disgruntled, that they earn, or that somehow they are deserving of these monies. They didn't get the raise they thought they were supposed to get, and I'm just taking what's really owed to me. And those guys are walking away. They're in their beach house this weekend, and I'm pissed. I'm going to steal. I'm going to take this money, and I'm going to build my own pool, which they do.
Or it's almost even like what you were saying. It's like, I chose to come and work at this little investigation shop instead of working on Wall Street where I could have a home in the Hamptons. So my sacrifice deserves this bonus that I'm giving. I mean, it can be something as stupid as that they could.
Yeah, well, I did it because it was more fun.
Right, exactly. Well, I'm not accusing you of embezzlement. Don't get me wrong. That's not what I'm trying to say here. But so along with the trust stuff, here's the other thing, because I'm sort of looking just for your permission to continue saying this on our podcast, because something that stuck with me from your podcast, you interviewed a guy, I'm pretty sure his name was Stephen E. Taylor, who was a district attorney in California. And at the very end of your podcast, you were asking me, you're like, so what can people do to not be victims of fraud so much? And he says, and the guy, so intelligent, had so much to say, did not seem to me to have too much of a sense of humor, and said very, very matter of factly, it's like, you need to make sure everybody in the accounting department doesn't like each other. And I re-listened to that episode, and you started laughing because you thought it was a joke, and he just continued going, absolutely, make sure. He didn't get this hyperbolic, but it's like, they got to hate each other. Make sure that you've got one Republican, one Democrat, one anarchist, and a hippie, and then they'll all so that kind of thing. It's like they'll all want to throw each other under the bus as soon as they possibly can. So A, do you remember that? B, do you agree with that?
Yeah, he's a great guy. I got to know him over the course of that time frame. But yeah, I mean, the one of the basic rules, of course, and again, I go back, you're never going to get rid of it all. You can only dissuade people and tamp it down, and hopefully catch things when they start happening earlier in the time frame, and don't let it go for 20 years. So, but the problem becomes when it's at the church and you've got one bookkeeper. That's it. There's no other, right? You've got you got some trustees or whatever overseeing, but not really. You know, she puts together the numbers and it submits it. So there's no check and balance. So yeah, in a bigger organization, absolutely. You want to have those checks and balances. You want to have different people handling different aspects of the cash flow, and limits on how much things, you know, how big a wire can, so, you know, how big a check can be cut, etc. And having dual or multiple signatories. Those kinds of checks and balances are very important. The other thing that I think is really important is at least the appearance of oversight. Actual oversight, meaning, okay, we're going to be in here, we're going to audit every quarter, whatever, every 3 years, but then you know it's coming. So having these random audits and having it really go very, you know, without warning, and at least that having that threat over the top. And actually, you have to, in order to have that threat exist, the appearance of oversight, you have to actually do it in. So you might have a random audit and whatever, purchasing, then you're going to do it over here, and some other department, sales, whatever, and just so that the word comes on down from on high that this organization takes fraud seriously. We don't, you know, and you're going to get prosecuted and thrown out on your ass, which is a whole nother thing. It used to be in the old days, companies were loath to turn it over to prosecutors because they didn't want to be embarrassed. But think of nonprofit, where you're asking for monies from, you know, your donors, and then all of a sudden you're hit, you know, somebody stole $3 million over the course of the last 12 years in your bookkeeping group. You know what that does to your whole fundraising and the whole reputation. It's devastating.
Absolutely.
But again, very light on the controls, right? It's a nonprofit, almost by definition. You just, you know, and you got board members who are believers in the cause, whatever that might be. Not moguls in accounting and finance, right?
Yeah.
So the oversight tends to be light. They tend to be victims. I wrote articles about nonprofit embezzlement cases, and it's just legion.
Yeah.
So anyway, go.
Well, another thing I got to ask you about while I got you, because you really put this on my radar, and it's missing from other sources about fraud, because you really emphasized regularly the impact of gambling as a pressure for people to embezzle. And so I locked in that. I think I want to say at one point, and again, it might have been in your podcast, so I think you were just kind of off the hip going that in your experience, and again, please correct me if I'm wrong, but you said something like, in your experience, like a third of the people that you caught embezzling had some kind of gambling history. Does that sound right, or am I?
That sounds a little high.
Okay,
I can't remember the exact, but the answer is yes. I mean, that was one of the factors. I didn't do it initially. I kept adding these little factors. Was gambling? I put a gambling category in the last few years when I was doing this analysis, and it surprised the hell out of me. But it's logical that there, a fair percentage. I can't remember. Maybe it was 10 or 12 or whatever. It was a lot. It seemed to be a lot.
Percentage, yeah.
A high percentage of people who were embezzling had gambling problems, and they get over their skis, right? They get over their skis. They've already mortgaged the house, double mortgage, etc., and then they start stealing, right? And this I saw what I thought was a direct link. There was some cause and effect in the gambling issue. So we were talking before, Greg, about whether or not should companies outlaw or not outlaw, I think it would be really difficult to say, no gambling rule at this company. How do you enforce it and how do you catch it and whatnot? It's tough, but I think more recently, it's recognized as an addiction. You can become addicted to gambling, and it can really have devastating effects on families and companies that fall victim to that. And looking for those signs, looking for the warning signs when somebody gets into trouble, and trying to help them before it becomes a real problem for them and you, is what I think is important. You think about that also with people when you have other traumatic incidents that happen. You want the company should have some role in trying to help that employee. Even when you're doing a mass layoff, help these people rather than having a bunch of disgruntled people that might take, they're going to steal your technology, they're going to do something, whatever, nefarious against the company, or they're going to post nasty grams all over the place. Do the right thing here. Some of these people will work for you for a long time. They're laying off these people, or one person you're laying off, even if they did bad things, and you're laying them off for cause. You don't want them to be fixated on you as the enemy, somebody that they would come back and do harm. You see this in workplace violence situations, right? So it's a little counterintuitive because, we're helping this person that just stole from us or whatever.
Right.
Okay, let's work out a restitution plan. Let's figure it out. And they can't pay you back or whatever, if it's a tough situation. So I was just saying earlier, the point was, in the old days, people didn't report these things to law enforcement nearly as much as they do now. And I tell every client, or any time in this situation, you gotta prosecute, because a lot of the work we do is vetting executives in key roles, whether it's an mergers and, you're buying a company, you vet the top 5 people, or you're financing a company, you're going to vet the whole company and the key officers and directors. In those circumstances, if it's not reflected in the public record, or we're not allowed to interview and talk to people, you're not going to find out necessarily if it was something that got swept under the rug. So somebody in finance that steals and they swept under the rug, and we're not going to report this, we're not going to prosecute. They go on and do it again, right?
Yeah.
At the next company. So
absolutely.
So I want to ask you about something, because you just said in the old days, a lot of this stuff didn't get reported, didn't become prosecuted. Kind of in that same spirit of that is, how important are whistleblowers and how integral are they to discovering fraud versus, say, early in your career? Has that changed over time?
I think it has. Yes. And I think it's critical. Whistleblowers are key. And now, we see in the news today, so what could be the most massive political fraud situation going on, if true, right? But and there's also potential abuse of whistleblowers, and then you've got a whole cadre of lawyers who are focused on these key TAM whistleblower statutes that they use to get companies to respond to. Mostly, I think by and large, for positive results, positive, reason. Companies doing something wrong, whatever. There was a problem with the gasket on the vehicle, and these issues cropped, and everybody needs to be made whole. Or something bad was going on in the company, and now they need to fix it. And there's ultimately, maybe there's a some trustee that gets brought in, a monitor that's brought in to oversee for the next 5 years, and they got to pay monies to the victims, etc. So, having the whistleblower statutes and protecting those whistleblowers from retaliation, I think, is critical, so that they can come forward. And again, I always been an advocate. I wrote an article back in the the late '80s about hotlines. This is a long time ago.
Yeah.
That how important they were in the overall sort of HR employee thing. Where we want to be able to report anonymously, bad things that are going on. Because if you don't hear about it, then it just continues to fester and get worse. somebody's abusive in the workplace, sexual harassment's going on, or whatever out in the branch office, stealing's happening, etc. So those things need to come to the fore as quickly as possible. So it's in the company, generally in the company's best interest to encourage that to come forward, and most large companies have, a well-defined whistleblower process that hopefully you get it before it becomes a litigated whistleblower case, where people are where it really becomes serious. So yeah, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act situations, which are being prosecuted a lot more these days than they once were. All of these things are important to bring to the fore. So Caleb, I think you're right. It's important that you allow people to come forward with information. You got to run it down. You've got to do an internal investigation and figure out, well, how, is this true? Are there elements to this true? And if they are, you've got to make corrective action and demonstrate those corrective actions. And so that the organization as a whole, you operate positively, upbeat, treat your people right, all constituents, whether not just customers, not just your shareholders, but the employees are a whole constituency. That if you're not treating them right, and I've seen cases time after again, where you got big high turnover of employees, you're just gonna have massive problems with people doing stuff that are not in the company's best interests. So treat the employees right and give them some outlets is a critical role in keeping the company clean, as it were.
Yeah. Okay, so I want to make sure we got enough time to cover this, because this is maybe the thing I want to ask you more than anything else. And really this goes back even to the Marquet reports on embezzlement. Just thinking back through your career, through all the research that you've done on frauds just in general, you're a fraud aficionado. We like to consider ourselves fraud enthusiasts. What are some of what are some of the cases, like maybe 2 or 3 tops of the cases in your mind that were like, these were some of the most interesting frauds that were perpetrated that are on your radar? Do you have anything to throw out, like juicy ones?
Well, they're the obvious ones. I mean, today in the news, you've got Elizabeth Holmes going to jail finally. I think that was an interesting case. And here you had this phenom female executive that everybody was willing to go along with. And again, nobody really willing to come forward. I mean, there were a few voices, but nobody really willing to buck the trend and say, "Hey, there's nothing here," right? And it gets to the point where it becomes a publicly traded company, and all these investors are defrauded in this day and age, right? No less. So
now, is that something when you do like the vetting of executives? Is that part of I don't know if there was much to vet with Elizabeth Holmes, but that's part of what you're talking about, is you're trying to make sure that people aren't getting into those positions that would be, where there's red flags already that this might end poorly.
Correct. So the best predictor of the future is the past, but it's not always, even if the past isn't predicting anything, that doesn't mean something can't happen in the future. So if you're seeing somebody, if we put her under a microscope back in 2000, whatever, 4, 5, whenever she drops out of Stanford, and there were little indicators of somebody who liked to fluff things up, perhaps, but it depends on how deep you're going. So obviously, if there's cases, litigation, disputes with prior business partners, etc., those are the things that you want to pull out. Maybe a bankruptcy of a company, or there's a dispute with your old business partner that might have direct bearing on how you advise. So certainly, obviously, criminal stuff. It doesn't come up. If I'm vetting a new director of a publicly traded company, there's not going to be a criminal shit situation in their past,
right.
other than
Right.
traffic violation, maybe a DUI, right?
Yeah.
So it's the other elements of your how well do you work well and play well with others? The companies that you were involved in the past, how did they fare? Did you, were you seen as somebody that was objective, and et cetera? All those sort of less tangible elements that might show, this is a good candidate to sit on our board, or this to be the new CFO. They've got their licensing, never had a complaint, et cetera. All these things that you want to dig into and try to give the client a better feel for, better comfort level as to who they're getting into bed with, whether it's a hiring situation or it's an acquiring situation or whatever. So yes, and with the Elizabeth Holmes, I think there were things, but she was a youngster, right? I call her, so right out of, she didn't finish college, so she's 20, 21 years old.
Yeah,
a youngster,
she didn't have time to make up a fake product prior to this.
Yeah, so are you interviewing people? But as time, so she starts the company, whatever, and things go along. And I think there was some turnover there. So these are the kind of people you want to identify. If down the road, you're going to acquire this company, let's say, and you want to try to identify these people. Why'd you leave? Some people aren't going to be willing to talk, either for legal reasons or they don't want to get involved. Others will, or they'll talk anonymously. Okay, fine. So you're going to be a source, and we're not going to attribute this to anything, but so that I can then advise the client. Okay, this is what happened in this circumstance, whatever. So and then I'm going to try to advise the client, best from what I'm seeing. And hopefully they'll make a decision it's good for them and for everybody.
Yeah.
So that's a case where you want to vet people deeply, trust but verify, right? People say stuff all the time. You look at a resume. I wrote another article. It's been out there for decades. The top 10 resume lies.
Oh, nice.
Which keeps bubbling back. People lie about their education all the time. They lie about their credentials, their certifications, and all this stuff. They'll fill in a gap, where they were sitting at home in the basement. So they expand the dates of employment. All kinds of stuff that you want to try. We try to suss that out when we're digging deep into an executive, and bringing those issues forward. So why'd you leave? Well, they actually spent 2 years in jail during that time. I had a case like that where senior executive company was being acquired, very successful company, but back in his college days, he was dealing large sums of drugs, and went to jail for a short period of time. Relatively.
Okay.
But that came out. And they lied about it.
Right. Hobbies and interests, when people are like, I love reading Dostoevsky. Bullshit. Nobody likes reading Dostoevsky. That kind of stuff too.
Well, so we're not psychologists.
Right. Okay.
I mean, there are firms that do these questionnaires for prospective employees, and they try to get a profile and whatnot.
Right. I had to take one of those ones. I was very nervous. I didn't know what they were going to find. Am
I answering this what I think they should? Right. The way they think they should do it, or am I answering the way I really feel?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So
am I gonna not get this job and somebody's gonna diagnose me as bipolar? What's happening here? I don't understand the purpose of this.
That's right.
Can you dig back to the Marquet report days and think of an embezzlement case that was like a real, like one that you went, wow, that was juicy. That was a good one.
Well, actually, so there's a gazillion of those. Most interesting in investments, it's usually a solo perpetrator. It's not a conspiracy of people getting together, and that does happen where somebody in purchasing has got somebody on the outside, they're cutting checks and they're sharing the proceeds. But more often than not, it's a single person within the organization that's taking advantage of their position. And so the conspiracy cases just aren't as frequent. I was thinking of actually a case I got involved in back in my Kroll days. I was down in South Florida. It was a rental car company that was being acquired by a large Japanese company, and so this rental car company is not a big name or anything, but it was down regional in Florida. It was a family-run business, and they basically treated it as their own little personal piggyback, and they defrauded. They did a number of people ended up going to jail, but this is a case we were doing there was a post facto situation. Japanese company had acquired them, and now things started coming out, and the numbers weren't right, and this and that, and so they were like, what the hell's going on down there? So we got brought in to do this, essentially an internal investigation, and it was just one thing after the next that these guys were doing. I mean, they would inflate the repairs on vehicles, or the price of the gasoline that for people that bring it in. Oh, it's instead of $7.25, it's $9.32, and they would keep the rest. One thing after that, they cooked the books. And again, this goes back to that earlier situation where they had ex-employees legion throughout South Florida. And I interviewed tons of them. And everyone would say, every time I go to do an interview, and they're like, yeah, I want to talk. I hate that company.
Yeah.
I would talk. They would bring up some other issue that was going on: harassment in the work, violence, threats, discriminating in employment situation. You name it, they were doing it. And the biggest thing being that they had defrauded the acquirer on how much reserves they had. So we had the forensic accountants were involved, and I got tipped off on this by somebody who was in the finance department, an ex-employee. So we knew to look for it, and sure enough, they had inflated the reserves so that it looked like the value of the company was more than it actually was.
Yeah.
So people went to jail. This group of family folks, bunch of them went to jail, and there was a lot of crazy other stuff that happened there.
Florida, am I right?
Well, Florida Man Friday, right?
Right.
Yeah.
This is back in the day. So, the case was so fast, it just kept morphing. It kept growing.
Mm-hmm.
I probably did 100 interviews of different former employees down in South Florida. And it just was, I was just like, I'd come in at the end of the day. We got the forensic accountants in this corner, and the other, investigators. I said, what do you got, Chris? I said, you're not going to believe this. But they said so-and-so was doing this in the workplace. And they, brandished a gun and did the,
Jeez, what?
But, I mean, just.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah.
That was one of the funnest, weirdest cases ever.
Where your wife is like, please tell me about your day at work. That kind of stuff.
Feedback. I was in California. I was based in California at the time. I went down there. So I'm calling her. I'm like, you're not.
Right. That's
awesome. There were a lot of cases, like a lot of interesting things that have happened to me over these years, death threats, contract.
People threatened your life?
Oh yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Like
public corruption cases, international cases where
Gotcha.
Latin American, whatever.
Yeah, the Yakuza crime syndicate was like, "Hey, you need to back off of our car dealership in Florida, or else there's going to be."
It was a mob case in New Jersey. New Jersey casino business case.
Oof.
So
again,
Chris,
it sounds pretty sexy. I'm just saying, this all sounds pretty sexy.
I mean, the facts are sexy. Yes, the actual digging in. Can sometimes be a little monotonous. All right,
you're in the basement. Okay. You're in the basement of a dusty courthouse looking at.
So that was the old days.
Yeah, right. Of course. Right. Yeah. So looking back, I'm just curious. I'm going to ask you to go deep here a little bit, but do you think, was there anything about your worldview before you started this work that suited you well to do it, and has over the course of your career, has your worldview changed because of the work? So those are a couple of hard questions.
Those are good questions, Caleb. I would say, I think, I was always kind of an analytical person, just from my math science head.
Mm-hmm.
But I also, I think, was an inquisitive person, and always, willing to look outward. And that was I think that's a critical factor. Being an investigator writ large, a large definition investigator, you really have to be somebody that's, you get a hold of the bone and you don't let go and you keep working it. And so that sort of inquisitiveness is I think a prerequisite, and willing to dig deep into a given case. And even when things look normal, it's got to be, because your tummy tells you something's wrong here or there, right? Usually when your tummy tells you something, you got to listen to that tummy. And this is for everybody. Everybody has that tummy feeling sometimes. And I say, listen to it, because you're often correct in your feel. This person just rubbed me the wrong way. Something weird here. So you got to dig into cases, and some oftentimes those are the linchpins that turn. You find something that really turns the case. And over time, did it turn me? Have I gotten more jaded in humanity, and people steal all the time? A little, yeah, I think a little bit.
Yeah.
You see, because I was shocked. You look at the Ponzi schemers, how brazen these people were. By the way, Ponzi schemers, 90% male.
Yep.
Right. Whereas the embezzlers, 2/3 were female. Anyway, so
well, and I gotta say,
I'm like, okay, I've seen this before. Yeah, this happens. A little shocking how often it happens, I guess.
Yeah. I feel like, again, it had been years since I had listened to your podcast, but I re-listened to that Stephen E. Taylor episode before to prep for our podcast. And at the beginning of the podcast, I can't remember exactly what you said, but it was something like, just remember our motto here on Fraud Talk: at all times, everywhere, every business, somebody's trying to screw you over, something like that. And I go, yes. And now this guy's saying he's not jaded. Bullshit. He doesn't realize how jaded he is.
All right. Okay. All right. So yeah, at any given time in any organization, there's always somebody who's up to no good.
That's it. That's the one. I was so close.
I heard that too.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
yeah, I guess my last question, and I don't know, sorry if you kind of said something, if you already kind of touched on this, but like, is there anything about your work that still surprises you?
Well, it sort of seems cyclical, right? Meaning the same characters keep popping up, even though they're different names, right? And so, like, we'll examine an executive, and he'll have certain characteristics. I say, I've seen this person before, not really, but I can then tell the client, did they do this and that? But yes. Really? Yes, I've seen this before. So it's sort of this thing that, that it just keeps coming around. You can predict based on certain characteristics, what people are like, and, their behaviors based on characteristics. So yeah, that's, and it, I guess I shouldn't be surprised by it, but it's an interesting and fun thing that, and I think a value that I bring to the clients is, yeah, I can tell that, this industry in real estate, we got to be careful. This type of person, whatever.
Right.
I've seen this before.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's 40 years this summer. Woo.
Yeah. Nice.
Wow. Hard to believe. I'm not quitting either, man.
Good. Nice. So what is the Planck constant? That's my last question.
Planck's constant. Yeah. I forget.
Okay, good. And I also looked that up, and it's actually incomprehensible, just what Google sent back. So awesome. Like I said,
we have AI for now, right?
That's exactly. Right. Yeah, we don't need physics.
That's my next white paper is on AI fraud. What are the risks what are the fraud risks from AI, from like ChatGPT or whatever?
Yeah. So, awesome. Well, and that leads me to just this. How can people, like, if people are interested in your past white papers and your future white papers, how can people follow you, and what's the best way for people if they have needs of a fraud investigator to get a hold of your company?
So I'd say go to Veritas, VERITASAP.com. That's our firm. And I still have a Twitter handle of Fraud Talk is my Twitter handle. So I put out stuff on embezzlement still to this day.
Nice.
Put out for big cases. on my fraud. Generally speaking, I do a little commentary on other things, but mostly the fraud stuff. So veritasap.com is where I can be reached.
Excellent. And then, and is Twitter the best place for people to go to find white papers and other things you published?
Or LinkedIn, actually. I have them on my LinkedIn profile. Yeah, so you can look up Chris Marquet, Veritas, and LinkedIn. And
perfect.
I've got a whole bunch of white papers that have been published on my LinkedIn profile. Yeah, thank you.
Awesome. Okay, very good. Chris, thank you.
Caleb,
thanks a million for.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks for having me on. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, for us too. All right, that's it for this episode. Remember, if you don't hate everyone else in your department, then you're not really committed to preventing fraud.
And also remember, earning 3 degrees in physics, economics, and philosophy is great preparation for a career, either as a fraud investigator or as a cashier at Barnes & Noble.
If you want to drop us a line, please do. We'd love to hear from you. Send us an email at ohmyfraud@earmarkcpe.com. And Caleb, if people want to get a hold of you, where can they find you out there in the internet?
On Twitter at @CNewquist and LinkedIn // Caleb Newquist. Not 3 backslashes. I was just practicing saying the word.
Right. It's a tough one.
It is.
Yeah. Yep.
Greg, you still on the internet or did you give it up?
Gosh, geez, social media is just falling off for me. So feel free. Twitter @Greg Kyte, LinkedIn, I'm /Greg Kyte. If you just search me, I'm Greg Kyte CPA. But also, if just send me an email, greg@gregkyte.com. That'll get to my inbox. I'll see that pretty dang quick. So
old school, Greg.
Old school. Let's cut out the middleman. Just come into my inbox.
Oh My Fraud is written by Greg Kyte and myself. Our producer is Zach Frank. If you like the show, leave us a review. Share it with a friend. That's how people find the podcast. All right?
Yeah.
Leave us a review.
Do it.
Write a review. Rate the show. And subscribe wherever you get podcasts. It's everywhere. If you listen to podcasts, wherever you listen to them, get the podcast at that place.
It's there.
It's there.
Do you listen to Mark Maron? Same place.
Same place.
We're there.
Same place. Yeah. And for the accountants, Earmark, CPE, super duper.
It's so good. So good, so easy.
Yeah.
I'm racking them up this year.
Yeah, you got 100? You got 100 hours of CPE?
No, but I'm if I continue this pace by the end of my 2-year reporting period, I think I will have what would it be? It'd be 120 between 120 and 160 hours of CPE.
Damn.
Yeah.
Well done.
Yep, not bad.
Join us next time for more avarice, swindlers, and scams from stories that will make you say, "Oh my fraud."
Oh my fraud.